It is often said that Advent begins in the dark. At that moment when the world feels lost and hopeless, a message came, an announcement, a holy announcement. Jesus is coming. As the pandemic trends upward once again and hope seems in short supply, maybe this Advent season has come just in time. We track this season every year, the season of light that remembers Jesus coming into the world. He gave up the heavens that were not large enough to contain him and let himself be contained in Mary's womb. Mystery so large becomes baby so small. But this mystery is the story we tell this season of light, because in the waiting, in the patience, in the containment, in the dark, we find hope. Jesus has come and will come again. Christ, whose glory fills the skies, Christ the everlasting light, the Son of righteousness, arise and triumph o'er these shades of night. And come, thou long-awaited one, in the fullness of your love, and loose this heart bound up by shame, and I will never be the same. So here I wait in hope of you, all my soul's longing through, and days spring from on high be near, and days star in my heart appear. And dark and cheerless is the morn, until your love in me is born, and joyless is the evening song, until Emmanuel has come. So here I wait in hope of you, all my soul's longing through, and days spring from on high be near, and days star in my heart appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel. In our secret yearnings, we wait for your coming. And in our despair, we doubt that you will. And in this privileged place, we are surrounded by witnesses who yearn more than do we, and by those who despair more deeply than do we. Look upon your church in this season of hope, which runs so quickly to fatigue, and this season of yearning which becomes so easily quarrelsome. Give us the grace and the impatience to wait for your coming, to the bottom of our toes, to the edges of our fingertips. We do not want our several worlds to end. Come in your power and come in your weakness and make all things new. Amen.
How I live for the moment where I'm still in your presence. All the noise dies down. Lord, speak to me now. You have all my attention. I will linger and listen. I can't miss a thing. Lord, I know my heart wants more of you. My heart wants something new, so I surrender all. All I want is to live within your love, be undone by who you are. My desire is to know you deeper. Lord, I will open up again, throw my fears into the wind. I am desperate for a touch of heaven. You're the fire in the morning, you're the cool in the evening, the breath in my soul, oh, the life in my bones. There is no hesitation in your love and affection. It's the sweetest of all. Lord, I know my heart wants more of you. My heart wants something new, so I surrender all. All I want is to live within your love, be live within your love, be undone by who you are. My desire is to know you deeper, Lord. I will open up again, throw my fears into the wind. I am desperate for a touch of heaven. La da 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 da, la da 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 da, la da 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 da.
We are saddened that due to the increases in cases and restrictions, we weren't able to get together for our yearly Advent service. These are difficult times, but we look forward to future opportunities for sharing in our community and building new connections. We will continue to provide you with updates on the Christmas Eve services as to what they may look like and what we are to expect as Alberta Health releases new information. And take heart, He's in the waiting. In spite of all that's changing, our December menu is coming up in full stride. We are constantly working and reworking our menu to adapt to changing rules and restrictions. We are committed to providing you the best possible opportunities to stay connected here at Westside. Our December menu is designed to foster these connection points. One of the highlights will be a webinar hosted by Westside's missionary partners from Hands at Work, featuring familiar faces such as George Snyman and Lynn Kotowitz, to name a few. They'll be sharing their stories of missions work and a message on what God's stirring in Africa. Go to wkc.org/menu to register and check out everything else we have in store for you this December.
We are hardwired for community, being known, valued, and loved are deep needs that we require for human flourishing. Prior to COVID, one of the great health challenges we were being faced with is actually loneliness.
So you're saying before this pandemic hit us and we were in lineups and trying to figure out how we were going to find everything we needed, we already had a very serious issue in loneliness.
I mean, COVID has stopped so many aspects of our lives, but what hasn't stopped is our messy wrestling with life's daily challenges.
Yeah, it's interesting for all of us because we're all in it together. Life's moving along, we've got everything planned the way we think, and then suddenly there's a challenge. It can be with work related, it can be a family related item, just a personal item that's kind of hit us all of a sudden. But the beautiful part is we don't have to be alone in these moments, and that's where pastoral care is pretty significant.
Yeah, you're right. And the beauty of pastoral care is that you're not alone, and that another voice joins you on your journey as we come together. Instead of going around your problems, we actually journey through them with one another in that symbiotic relationship.
See, now you're dabbling into discipleship. I love it because it's interesting. So often we hit this roadblock or this thing that lands in front of us, and it's either we can avoid it and say, I'm just going to ignore it, or I've ignored it for years, or it's part of our history, or we can say, let's go through it. And that's terrifying. But God wants us as we grow with Him to go through it. But don't we just get counseling for stuff like that? And why us? I mean, how does that work together?
Well, that's a really great point, Bobby. And we do really highly value our mental health professionals. And we do believe that professional counseling and pastoral care actually are best when they go hand in hand. I mentioned something called symbiotic relationship, and I think that's the key to pastoral care. It's this relationship that works in tandem together as we journey through the difficulties of life.
Maybe one of the hardest parts is how do we do it? Because sometimes we get a little nervous figuring out, okay, what does that look like? And you've got a great structure in place and it works incredibly well. Tell us about how that comes together when we have a need.
Well, that's actually the easy part. So how you get connected with our pastoral care team is by simply emailing us at care@wkc.org. You're going to give us a brief description of what you're facing in your life, and we aim to have somebody respond to you within 24 hours to create that pastoral care connection for you.
Maybe the hardest part is just sending that email shaping and saying, I don't want to go around this any longer. I want to go through, but I trust that there's people that are going to help me do that. And I think that's an incredible way to lock into the gospel. and say, man, I don't know, I'm new to church, I didn't understand this, I've actually never been connected to a church community, and now suddenly this issue I can sort, or something that's happened suddenly, that I'm not alone in this moment together. Kristen, what a great opportunity to not only for ourselves, but what about for others around us? Because sometimes we forget, we so love our church, we love the opportunity that we bring to it, but what about our people at work and finding out a certain situation? How do we embrace them, and are they allowed to be a part of this?
Yeah, absolutely, Bobby. So our pastoral care team is here for our community, but it's also here for our wider community. If you're going through a hard time, or if it's somebody you know, like you gave a suggestion of somebody in your office or an extended family member, we're here for them as well. We're here to support our larger community.
Joe, it's just a great thing. It's what God intended, that we would never go through journey alone. He always said the phrase that we've used so much here is, come follow, come walk with us, and that's the beauty of it. Westside, this is a great thing that we say no matter what situation. You're having a great week, that's wonderful. There's a challenge that has come up for you. Man, we want to be a part of it. We want to support you and see what God always planned for your life.
This is our last week in Galatians, for now. We'll be returning to this teaching series with a focus on chapter 2 next year. But we're actually only a few weeks into this letter from Paul, and actually only a few verses, and already he's offered some relatively radical opinions. In fact, as some of you have told me, he's even saying some pretty destabilizing stuff. Well, he continues some more in chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. It reads like this, the letter does. It says, "For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." Now, in our last video, we examined Paul's exclusive claims about the gospel, its singularity and its particularity. And that theme continues in these few verses here. Paul is claiming that the gospel is the only gospel. There's no diet version, caffeine-free version, or cherry-flavored gospel. There's only the original one. And now, theologically, most of us consent quite easily to this, but it becomes much harder when we think about the social and cultural impact of this, like we talked about in our last session. We often find it difficult to think critically about our worldview, our culture, and our society because we live in them. It's kind of like the story of the fish swimming towards one another. And one fish says, "Hi, excellent day, the water's lovely." To which the second fish replies, "What's water?" And see, because part of the reason it's hard for us to reflect critically on our own world, or with Paul's encouragement, like how the gospel might adjust our world, is that we humans, we don't really like to contend with the possibility that we might be wrong. We like to think that we are right, that our way is the best way, that everyone else is just a little bit behind us. Psychologically, we construct elaborate processes and tricks of the mind to convince ourselves that we are on the right path. It's not that we can't improve, we say, but that this is definitely the right way to go about that. And as a result, most of us live in a sort of permanent form of confirmation bias, our tendency to experience the world through our already held beliefs. So it's kind of like when you say, hey, it's hard to drive in England because they drive on the wrong side of the road. To which we ask, is it wrong or is it just different? Now, if you consider it, confirmation bias makes sense. What kind of maniac would travel through life convinced they were wrong and doing nothing about it? So think about then, take all of this together and think about why it's difficult to analyze your own culture. Somewhat like the fish, most of us actually don't realize or don't even remember that our culture even exists. Often, actually, we don't remember that until we encounter a different culture. And then secondly, when we do encounter a different culture, our default setting is to assume that our culture is the correct one, is the right one. Now, let's think about that in relation to these early verses of Galatians. We assume that Paul's going to talk exclusively about theology, which, generally speaking, we're happy to think critically about. But Paul's actually setting us up for a conversation about how that theology, in this case the gospel, is impacting and critiquing our culture. More specifically, he's preparing us for a conversation that will explain how the gospel is in tension with culture, because it's going to invite us to live differently, not simply to believe something differently, but to live and think differently. You see, the problems that were drawing the Galatians into division and away from the gospel, although theologically rooted, were not theological in appearance. Actually, it was social and cultural issues that they were wrestling with. And the same is true today. We assume that the category of spirituality will sit comfortably within our life context without influencing or impacting other key categories, our culture, societal view, economic theory, or politics. But Paul doesn't want you to build your house like this, because for him, life is holistic. If your social view or cultural perspective isn't aligned with your spirituality, one of them will eventually be impacted by the other. What was it Jesus said about serving two masters? Yeah, he said you can't. You see, I realize that if we're not paying attention, this could sound like Paul is being kind of harsh and a little bit totalizing in these verses. And that sort of anything that's harsh and totalizing often sits quite uncomfortably for us in our time. But there's another way to think about it that's actually hugely liberating, because it levels all of us out. One culture or society or worldview isn't actually better than another unless it's a gospel one. They're all being assessed. All cultures, all societies are being assessed in relation to the grace of Jesus. And think about it. As Paul says elsewhere in Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, he says everything that isn't the gospel essentially falls short of God's best. But how can Paul actually go about saying this? How can he make such grand claims about the gospel? Well, he's actually going to explain that to us. After 12 verses of relatively engaged theological positioning here in chapter 1 of Galatians, Paul now offers his explanation in a way that we probably will sit a little more comfortably with, because he offers it by way of narrative, with a story. Paul essentially gives a testimony of his own experience. And you can track that beginning in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 13, reading through to the end of the chapter. It reads like this. This is Paul writing. He says, "You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many amongst my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him amongst the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human being, and nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, that's Peter, and stayed with him for 15 days. But I didn't see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard it said, 'The one who formerly was persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy.' And they glorified God because of me." So notice what Paul does and says at the very start of his story. In relation to his peers, he says he was among the best of the best. And this is quite common language around Jewish education systems of Paul's time. Like a Pharisee like Paul would have strived from a very young age to be the best in his various classes. This was the route to becoming a great and influential teacher. And Paul was up there. He was one of the best. So he positions himself like that, but then he turns around and sort of says to us, he was also one of the worst. Did you notice that he said he was violently intent on destroying the church? And this story checks out in the book of Acts. We see Paul in some sort of oversight role at the first execution of a Christian for their beliefs. And later we see Paul chasing Christians around looking to kill more of them. Like, this is quite a way to introduce yourself to a group of non-Jewish people in a church. Hi, I'm Paul, one of the best ever Jewish teachers, and I killed Christians. But there's a logic to why he's telling us this that becomes, well, clear throughout the letter. Whether Paul was the best or the worst, whether his culture revered him or celebrated him or feared him, Paul's pointing out that it wasn't really working for him. And then come three words that for me are the clincher in terms of how Paul's going to navigate everything for us. And they come in verse 15 of chapter 1. Paul says, "But when God." And this becomes the turning point for Paul. Not simply religiously, but as we'll see, in every area of his life. In the book of Acts in chapter 9, the story is told in some more depth. But essentially, Paul is traveling around the area like a crazed man trying to get rid of Christians. And while doing this, he's traveling to a town called Damascus, a city that, well, still exists in present-day modern Syria. While he's on that route, he has an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. Paul refers to it here in Galatians as a revelation of Jesus. Like, actually, in the language that Paul's writing in, he uses the word apocalyptic, which is kind of interesting because we often use that word today to describe a sort of end of the world type event. Whereas the Bible uses that word apocalyptic to talk about revelation, about things being opened up or made clear. It's like the curtains are drawn back. So Paul has this kind of clarity, this making clear, this revelation of who Jesus is. The text in Acts says he gets back up and heads on into town, and then his life translates from persecutor to preacher. Notice how Paul describes it in verse 23 of Galatians chapter 1. He says, "The one who persecuted us now proclaims the faith." What's fascinating to me is that Paul doesn't come to this change through reason or intellect or comparison of ideas. He has, as he calls it, a revelation of God, like a revealing, an unveiling, let's use that phrase again, a drawing back of the curtain on how things actually are. And Paul's doing something really important in the way that he's telling this story to us. It's subtly an explanation about how he thinks and how he thinks Christians should think. Essentially, it goes like this. No matter what you know, think you know, or even your strategy of how you know things, the first piece of a Christian foundation of life has to be Jesus. Well, that sounds easy enough, we say. Except, is it? Because often what we do with our lives is we build up our house of thoughts using ideology and knowledge and philosophy and logics. And then what we tend to do is apply those things to make sense of Jesus. We use the things we know to make sense of Jesus, who we don't know. So Jesus then, and therefore the gospel and our spirituality, are reasoned and assessed against all the other things that we know. This is known by philosophers as foundationalism, and it's really common amongst humans because, again, we like to think that the things that we think are right, make sense, and are defendable. But Paul builds a different thought house. Instead of assessing Jesus against all knowledge, he works from the position that the revelation of Jesus is true because it's a revelation from God. And then what he does is he assesses everything else against that. And this is why, in my opinion, Paul becomes this radical liberator. He avoids the cultural assimilation that threatened the early church. He believes in the equality of women with men. He even starts to dismantle notions of slavery and social status. None of these things he could do is if he was constantly working within his own cultural context. But this revelation of Jesus allows him to think differently. Because he has a revelation of Jesus, he sees that as the first thing that he thinks about. So what Paul is trying to do is teach us how to think. Our preference is to shape and define our ideas by our experiences. So now, we'd love to think that we were more rational than that, and that's the confirmation bias coming back again. But it's actually, generally speaking, our experiences that shape so much of how we think. Racism, sexism, stereotypes, bigotry, our ideas of our superiority are so often rooted in isolated encounters and experiences that we've had and not in reasoned thinking. But Paul, however, invites us to be initially shaped by Jesus and the gospel and allow that to shape how we see everything else. Is it possible that the reason we struggle to critique our own culture is because we're using our culture to assess the truth of the gospel rather than the other way around? Is it possible that the reason some people have given up on church and Jesus is because it's become impossible for them to find the difference between the church and the surrounding culture? So what Paul is telling us is that he has decided, due to how he encountered it, that the message of Jesus, about Jesus, is the paradigm through which he's going to view everything else. That revelation is the formative one. He's going to accept that everything preceding that isn't important to him now, who he was, how he got there, and that everything in advance of where he is now is going to be viewed through these lenses. Jesus, for Paul, is the truth that changes everything for him. And I mean, I realize that figuring out truth is complex these days. At some level, truth is stranger than it used to be, and it's harder to know what to trust. What Paul's offering us through a revelation of Jesus is a truth that is shaping and guiding. And I just wonder if that's what we need right now. In a time where facts are treated no differently than fiction, where one person's news is another person's fake news, it's increasingly difficult to know, how do you guide your life? How do you direct it? How do you make choices? And what Paul's offering isn't simply a spirituality that brings you calm in the midst of everything, but rather he's offering you a different and new way to think, where the gospel becomes not just a spirituality, not just a way of life, but a philosophy too, a way of thinking. And now, if you pay attention, you can see the switch that this makes even in Paul's life in this story. At the start of the story, he's among the best of the best. Yet by verse 22, he says that amongst the churches, nobody even knew what he looked like anymore. They simply knew that Jesus had turned his life around. He goes from battling for status and superiority amongst all of his friends to kind of largely being unknown, except that Jesus has changed him. Like, once you start to think about Jesus in holistic terms, in terms encapsulating culture, society, philosophy, ideology, and the likes, it starts to open up some really interesting questions about change. Like, are we all on a track of some sort? Are we heading towards a fixed point that we don't presently know but is somehow predetermined for us? Like, are we just the result of the stars aligning in a particular way at a particular moment and now your life is the way it is? Like, is our personality fixed? Is our life definitive the way it is? Like, can you change? Can you be changed? Like, Paul says he was in and amongst the best of the best who persecuted the church, and he then encounters God And this revelation of Jesus, and everything changes. So why does this matter? Like, why do Christians need to think about how we think? Well, for Paul, it's because the gospel is so very different. It's about a God who should stay distant, but doesn't. It's about a Jesus who should stay dead, but doesn't. It's about a revelation that should pass over Paul, but doesn't. You see, for Paul, the question isn't the logic of the gospel, but rather the logic of our should. If the gospel looks strange to us, if the gospel looks out of sync to us, if the gospel feels like it doesn't fit in our world, maybe it's not the gospel that should change, but our way of thinking, our culture, our values, our lives. And I think that this is good news. Like, if you think about it, this really frees us up. The pressure, the weight, the overwhelm to meet the sorts of standard that our culture is so often obsessed with, whether it's proving ourselves to our boss or our parents or our friends, neighbors, peers, and most commonly, that desire that we have to prove ourselves to ourselves. And this is why the gospel is important. Because it's a story about more than Jesus just coming to rescue our spirituality. But he wants to rescue how we live and how we think too. Maybe our initial shock at the destabilizing effect of the gospel can turn to hope. Hope because the world needs destabilizing. It definitely needs more than just a new spirituality. Like the current news feeds, they read like stuff that even Hollywood couldn't dream up, which kind of tells me that as a planet, we're not doing well. We need something different. And for Paul, who knew what it was to be the best and the worst, the answer was revealed to him in a flash, in this encounter on a road, in a revelation. We need something at our very core that reshapes everything. And so Paul offers us a model. If you're looking for hope, if you're looking to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense, if you're looking for satisfaction, having tried hard to obtain it on your own, maybe, just maybe, what you need is to let the gospel reshape more than just your spirituality. So may you find grace in the gospel. May the revelation of Jesus break out of the boundaries of your private spirituality and reshape and reform the way you think and live. May you see how the gospel critiques and redefines your understanding of culture and the world. And may you know that, like Paul, it doesn't matter what your past is or when it is that you encounter the revelation of Jesus. The grace that calls you can shape you, regardless of where and when it finds you. Grace and peace to you, my friends.